speaker tonight has served as the curator of Vermont history for the UVM libraries, the executive director of the Kentucky and Vermont Historical Societies, and the director of the William L. Clements Library at the University of Michigan. He's also authored or edited 25 books on Vermont and American history and related subjects, including tonight's topic of discussion, his biography of Ira Allen. Please help me welcome J. Kevin Graffagnino.
Thank you. Nikki Welly was my setup person for this, and I asked her an hour ago, do you want the short version, which is 40 minutes and parts of Ira, or do you want the long version, which is all of Ira? And she said, oh, the long version. So settle in, folks. A couple, 3 hours from now, you can all go home. It's nice to be here at the library where I learned to read. I grew up here in Montpelier as a boy in the 60s and spent more time in this library than any kid I knew and ran through more library cards than any kid I know. And I got them to change the rule down in the kids section. You were not allowed to take out books in the morning and bring them back the same day to get more books. And eventually I did this frequently enough that they said, oh, all right, you can take out more books on the same day. So. All right, Ira Allen. I started an article about Ira Allen for Vermont Life probably more than 30 years ago. And I used the catchphrase for most Vermonters, Ira Allen is a hard founding father to love. What I meant by that is that we have a reverential attitude about Tom Chittenden. Tom Chittenden is our first governor. He is the wise head of state. He's our George Washington, in effect. We absolutely adore Ethan Allen. You think of the number of things in this state that are named after Ethan Allen: laundromats, bowling alleys, highways, National Guard units, et cetera, et cetera. Ethan is our version of Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, the rough, tough frontier guy who could beat up any Yorker who happened to give Vermont trouble. And if you look for a national counterpart in Ira's own life for Ira, it's probably going to be Aaron Burr, somebody who also reached too high, tried to be too ambitious, not well trusted by his own generation, and not well loved in the 200 years since either of them passed from the scene. My point tonight is going to be it doesn't matter whether you like him. I think Vermonters have passed the age of all our founding fathers were heroes. All of our founding fathers were perfect, and they're all on pedestals for us to worship. I want you folks to think about Ira in human terms. He's terribly important in 18th century Vermont history. You've got to have him in the picture. You don't have to like him. Ira Allen is 19 years old when he comes up from Western Connecticut, where the Allen family had lived. He is the youngest of the Allen brothers. He comes here at age 19 in 1770. Ethan has just created the Green Mountain Boys to stop New York from exercising authority east of the Hudson River. Ira is full bore, like all of his brothers, a New Hampshire title Yankee. The question is, will New Hampshire granted titles obtain here, or will New York granted titles obtain here? The Green Mountain Boys' job is to make sure that it's New Hampshire titles and the Yorkers have no say, that they have no sheriff, no land surveyor with New York title is going to work here. Ethan is leading the Green Mountain Boys. He's busting heads. He's riding into Yorker towns to tear down houses, make death threats, etc., occasionally mete out a whipping to some stubborn Yorker. Ira takes a much more solitary path, and this will be true of him all his life. He works alone. He's not a leader of men. He's not a guy you want to drink with in the bar, etc. He looks around and he sees the frenzy of land speculation. In the 18th century, if you have money and you want to get more money, you invest in land. One person here is young enough to think Bitcoin is a good idea. The rest of us know it's just imaginary stuff. In the 18th century, land speculation is the equivalent of today's stock market. You have some money to put into something, you buy frontier land, which is very cheap, and you bank that as settlement moves into that area, your land will become more valuable. With the end of the French and Indian War, the removal of the French military threat in Canada, Vermont is the hottest real estate in New England after 1764. And the Allens throw everything they have into investing in New Hampshire granted title. Governor Benning Wentworth of New Hampshire grants about 2/3 of Vermont, the valleys. He leaves the mountains more alone. And if you've got money and you're a Yankee, and the Allens are certainly Yankees, you put your money into Vermont land title. Ira sees this. He sees the economic opportunity. He's not going to be a Green Mountain boy and go beat people up. Instead, he goes back to Connecticut, studies with a land surveyor for 3 whole weeks, and then goes back to Vermont and says, I am a master surveyor. Now, I've known some surveyors. They tell me it's moderately complicated work, even with 21st century equipment, much less 18th century. And they say, yeah, that's about like going to UVM med school for a semester and saying you're a brain surgeon. But Ira is never daunted the rest of his life. He's a master surveyor, and his surveying, in truth, is awful. He might be within a half a mile of where he says he is at any given point, or where he says your farm is at any given point. But he is much in demand. The folks who own the Vermont land do not live here. They live in Connecticut. They live in Massachusetts. They're speculators. And Ira says, you need to hire me. I need to lay out your township. I need to lay out the farms, the lots, so that you can sell them. He comes up for several consecutive summers and does nothing but land surveying, mostly north of Rutland. He gets an unparalleled knowledge of northern Vermont with an emphasis on northwestern Vermont. And he comes to realize that his brother's way of looking at real estate is flawed, because they're buying willy-nilly down in what are today Bennington, Rutland, Windham, Windsor counties, south of Rutland. They don't have any plan. And he goes back home in the winter of 1772-3. In January, he calls a family meeting in Connecticut and says, I have seen the future of the New Hampshire grants. The future is the Winooski River Valley from Montpelier to Burlington, north to Canada. If we dominate that, we dominate Vermont real estate, because the trade that we will be able to develop on Lake Champlain is going to make our fortunes. He calls the Champlain Valley the country my soul delighted in. And he's the youngest and the smallest of the Allens. Ethan's about 6'2", 240, which in 17th century is about Shaquille O'Neal size. He is the biggest, strongest, toughest guy on the grants. Ira's about 5'6", 130. His big brothers call him Stub because he's the little guy. But even though he's the little guy, he is persuasive enough that they join with him and they form the Onion River Land Company. The sole goal is land in the Champlain and Winooski valleys, and they ditch what they have in the southern part of the grants. That dream, real estate development, commerce, dominates the rest of Ira's life. By the American Revolution, the Onion River Land Company has 100,000 acres of northwestern Vermont, with an emphasis on the rivers that flow into Lake Champlain, and especially the mill sites. Where are the falls? Where are the places you can generate water power? Because your mills are going to be powered by your rivers. You don't have any electricity, you don't have steam, You are going to do what you can to set up sawmills, grist mills, trip hammer, forges, etc., that every little community will want as settlement moves in. Ira gets most of the mill sites running into Lake Champlain. 100,000 acres, Onion River Land Company is poised for greatness. And then the American Revolution comes, and it puts it all on hold. It puts it all on a back burner because the British are a mighty military force in Canada, and they are going to come south from Canada for major invasions and raids. If you live north of Rutland, they are going to sweep you up and either take you back as a prisoner or kill you. So it puts a halt on movement of settlement. If you live north, Thomas Chittenden lives in Williston before the war. He goes back to Arlington because that's where it's safe to live. But the war gives the Yankees on the grants an opportunity they didn't have because the war dominates New York thinking. We don't worry about what's going on in the grants because we have a revolution to win and to fight. New Hampshire is in the same boat. Massachusetts, the Continental Congress. They don't think about Vermont much. And the Yankees, the Allens, and their allies say, how about if America can break away from England, why can't we break away from New York? Why can't the rhetoric of brave yeoman farmers yearning to breathe free against aristocratic Yorkers work just as well here as it works in the seaboard with Thomas Paine and Patrick Henry and the Adamses talking about why the revolution is justified and good. They adapt the rhetoric of revolution to the local scene. And it eventually, in 1777, year and a half into the war, results in their creating and declaring an independent state. They first call it New Connecticut, then they switch, but turns out Western Pennsylvania has been called New Connecticut for a while, so they switch to Vermont. And so, voila, suddenly there's a 14th state on the American continent. Ira becomes one of the great defenders and advocates of this. You'd have thought Ethan first, Green Mountain Boy leader, but Ethan goes and gets himself captured at Montreal in September of 1775 in a very ill-advised military attempt to take the city away from the British. It's a disaster. Ethan spends the next 2.5 years in British prison. He's gone. Older brother Heman, long regarded in his own day and since as the most dependable, the most honest, the most potential-ridden Allen brother, he would have stepped up. But he dies in 1778 of the effects of sunstroke at the Battle of Bennington. Somebody has to fill the Allen family's shoes if their empire is to be protected, and Ira steps up. He becomes the secretary to Governor Thomas Chittenden and the council. The council is the forerunner of the state senate. They're an oligarchic group of men who have close family relations. They run Vermont with Thomas Chittenden. Ira does all their writing for them, and he's like a son to Thomas Chittenden. He becomes the state treasurer, which means the state's finances ride around in his saddlebags, but he's controlling Vermont's finances. He becomes the guy that Thomas Chittenden frequently sends out of state to talk to other states, to make us friends where we don't have any, to negotiate for Vermont's continued existence. Ira becomes the road guy who goes out and does these things. And probably most importantly to Ira Allen, there's little concern in these days for multiple office holding because nobody wants any of them. Ira picks up a passel of them. He becomes the state surveyor general. Vermont does not want to impose taxes. The government is not terribly popular. A lot of people are saying, well, I like New York, or I like New Hampshire, or I like Massachusetts, These guys over in Arlington, in Thomas Chittenden's kitchen, are not people we particularly support. So you don't want taxes, but you do need money. The way you make money is you grant new townships. Benning Wentworth missed a third of Vermont. It's a lot of acreage for Thomas Chittenden and the state of Vermont. The Surveyor General's in charge of that process. Now, putting the biggest land speculator in Vermont in charge of land speculation in Vermont, not something one would recommend. Ira benefits tremendously from this. He picks out the best towns, he picks out the best property in towns, he takes his fees from the state for his work, for his travels, for his expenses in grants of land. He's adding constantly to Ira Allen's personal portfolio of real estate. Along the way, he furthers his reputation as a young man. You got to watch pretty carefully if you're involved with him. As a surveyor, he tells a story about himself. He comes up in the summer of 1772 and he surveys the town of Mansfield, today's Stowe and Underhill, and he finds to his considerable unhappiness that his land is the top of the mountain. And in a pre-ski-tow, pre-tourist day, this is not valuable real estate. He knows this. He goes back to tell the men who hired him in Connecticut, I will sell you any land I own in the grants except my Mansfield lands. And they say, why is that, Ira? He says, because it is covered with valuable gumwood trees. Now, you don't know what a gumwood tree is. I don't know. They didn't know. They asked. And he said, the gumwood tree it's a hardwood. It's much like the cherry tree, so it's very valuable. I've been on the top of Mount Mansfield. There ain't no gumwood trees up there. It's covered with rock and ice and scrub pine. But by the time Ira is done spinning his little tale, the proprietors of Mansfield have bought his mountaintop at a profit and given him land in Stowe Village that he wanted anyway as part of his fee. During the Revolution, another story he tells about himself. Burgoyne is invading from Canada. I almost said California. I suppose they could invade from California. From Canada in the summer of 1777. A mighty British army that is death to Vermont if Vermont has no military to delay them. They can't defeat them. And Ira says, we've got to have a militia. He tells the governor and the council. And he's vehement about it. They say, we don't have any money. He said, we've got to figure this out. And they say, fine, little guy, you're so smart. You tell us. We'll give you till tomorrow morning. His story is he locks himself in his room at the inn and in the morning emerges with a plan. And you got to like Ira. He's always got a plan for something or other. And I'll mention this later on as well. He says, what we will do as a government, we will confiscate the land of any loyalist, any Tory, any supporter of England who lives in Vermont. We will take their property and we will sell it and we will exile them. Okay, we don't want a lot of loyalists in Vermont. We can sell their property. We can make money without taxes. This is a pretty good idea. Well, it works very well financially because there are a fair number of loyalists who have property. It also works very well for the Chittenden government. They can declare anybody they don't like a loyalist. Now, anybody who voted against Phil Scott in the last election, you're gone. You're a loyalist. And they do this quite effectively. It, shall we say, minimizes dissent in the new state of Vermont. Ira uses this process because the land is sold by sheriffs. They're called vendu or vendu sales. Public is asked to bid. And again, this is an Ira story on himself. Shows up to bid on a beautiful farm, wonderful property, and he looks around and he realizes, damn, there are people who will bid against me. That's not right. We can't have that. So he huddles with the sheriff, and the sheriff says to the crowd, folks, there's a glitch in the paperwork. I'll straighten it out. We'll meet here tomorrow at 12. Well, to you and me, that means 12 noon. To Ira and the sheriff, it means 12 midnight. So they gather at midnight, and the sheriff says, who'll bid a shilling for this lovely farm, sold to the short man in the lantern. Now, that he tells these stories about himself, again, is a good indication that he doesn't understand why people don't trust him. Throughout the war, the other thing that Ira becomes very, very good at is using the power of the printed word. He recognizes that with a weak military, that the Allens and their coterie are going to win a lot more battles persuading people than they are defeating military force. Ethan had been very good at this in the years before the Revolution. He becomes a very skilled pamphlet writer, full of fire and vigor and emotion that'll appeal to you. Follow me, boys stuff. Ira picks it up in Ethan's absence. And then Ethan comes back in 1778. And together, the Allen brothers bombard state and nation with all kinds of publications. We are, again, yeoman, honest farmers. We love America. We are patriots. Those Yorkers, well, first off, they're aristocrats. They're bad people. They're mean. And they're loyalists. All, to a man, Yorkers are all in favor of England in this revolution. They don't worry much about the facts. This is propaganda that they're producing. They quote and misquote Puffendorf and Locke and Blackstone and other legal authorities with no consideration for whether it's true or on point legally. But what they are really good at is talking to your heart, talking to why we have to stick together. It's the best example of the power of the backwoods press in the American Revolution era. We know all about the authors of the Seaboard, the Boston, New York, Philadelphia. We got lots of publications about them. We need a lot more on the Allens as the epitome of people who understood it back on the frontier as well. And that ability with words, I think, comes out most distinctly during the Revolution for Ira in what's known as the Haldeman negotiations. The British, the war is going back and forth. It's been raging for several years. Sometimes the British win a victory, sometimes we win a victory. We don't know what's going to happen. And the British come up with quite a brilliant idea. They look at Vermont, which has asked numerous times to be added to the Union as the 14th state and has been rejected by Congress. Wait till the war is over. New York objects and they're very powerful. We don't know what to do. It's so just be patient, Vermonters. And Britain looks at that and says, they can't get into the Union. Maybe they'd like to come back into the British Dominion. Maybe they'd like to be rejoined with Canada. And if we do that, then we split New England off from the American Revolution, and we have an enormous advantage in winning the war. So the Brits send somebody to talk to Ethan Allen, who's the only Vermonter they've ever heard of. He'd been a prisoner and a celebrity in England because he was so out there as a prisoner of war. They send a British spy to talk to him, and Ethan's response, I don't want to be Benedict Arnold. Arnold had been exposed by this point. But it's an interesting question, and he takes it back to Governor Chittenden and the council. 8 or 10 Vermonters are in on this, including Ira. And the council says, Congress shut the door to the south. They won't let us in. England has opened the door to the north. This is worth our talking about. Now, if you read any biography of Ethan Allen, any Ethan biographer from 1850 on will tell you Ethan was in charge. And I just don't buy it. If I'm going to commit treason, if I'm going to commit espionage, I don't want a heavy drinker, a braggart, a loud talker in charge of my secret negotiations. if I'm Thomas Chittenden, I want a sneaky, sly, devious little guy who you don't notice in any given room. And Thomas Chittenden may have thought as I did because he picked Ira Allen. He said, you're the guy who goes north to Canada to talk with the British about this. You're the one who negotiates for us. Ethan never goes north to talk to the Canadian or the British officials. Ira goes several times. He says, yeah, we're quite interested in this. The Brits very quickly say, we don't believe him. We don't trust him. He's a sneaky guy. It's like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall, get a straight answer out of this guy. But the prize is so big that they don't want to give it up. At the same time, American patriots in Vermont and the rest of the country are looking at this and saying, wait a minute, the British have stopped raiding in the Champlain Valley. The British are giving back prisoners to us as if we're buddies all of a sudden. What's going on? What's Ira Allen doing up there? They'll hang him for sure, or shoot him if they think he's serious in these conversations. The British will certainly imprison him if they come to think that they're being led on. This is pretty tricky business. I don't think I'd have succeeded at this. I don't think I have a backbone of titanium that would have been required to conduct this business well. And at one point, it becomes necessary for Ira to talk to both sides in the same room at the same time. And he has to satisfy them both. The June 1781 session of the Vermont legislature says, come on down, you're going to talk to us in open session, i.e. the public will be in the galleries. And Ira knows that Frederick Haldimand has sent 2 British spies south to attend the session. What does he say when he's not up north with us? And Ira gives one speech and makes them both happy. The Americans say, yeah, okay, he's leading them on. He's keeping the British military penned up in Canada. And the British spies say, yeah, he's serious. He really is going to do this. And Ira writes decades later, is it not serious to see 2 opposing sides hearing the same thing, believing what they wish to believe, and thereby deceiving themselves? And I would say, yes, this is curious. This is a good indication of Ira's bravery, his cleverness, his cunning ways, and his ability to do things that I wouldn't have had the guts to do. Okay. In the fall of 1781, it comes to fish or cut bait time for the Allens. The British, give it a try. The British send an army south from Canada. They park at the south end of Lake Champlain with a proclamation that says, welcome Vermont back into the British Dominion. Now this is the Allens are going to have to either tell Vermont, yes, we're doing this and we're serious, or they're going to have to flee to the British lines because the Americans will hang them. And this is, oh gosh, the autumn of 1781. They're right on the cusp of we can't trick anybody anymore. And then news comes from Virginia. Cornwallis has surrendered at Yorktown. And the war is over. The revolution has won. We've succeeded. The British go back to Canada. And Ira immediately starts controlling the narrative. It becomes for Vermonters for the next 150 years. We didn't mean it. We were tricking the British. We were brave patriots. We never would have considered this seriously. And I would guess till about 1950, you couldn't stand in front of a Vermont group and say, yeah, I think they meant it. They were at least willing to consider it because Vermonters were not willing to accept that about the Founding Fathers. In about 1940, the scholarly tide starts to change, and scholars point out some evidence that had been there but hadn't been really considered. One, that Ethan and Ira Allen keep the negotiations going after the war is over. There's no military threat from Canada after 1783, but Ethan and Ira keep writing to Haldeman to say, we'd still like to do this. This would be advantageous. Vermont does not want to join the Union. Okay, that's interesting evidence. More compelling for me is that while most Vermonters would not have benefited economically from this reunion with Canada, all of the Allen real estate is on Lake Champlain, and when you start to trade, you will trade with Canada, because Lake Champlain flows north and you move your goods on water. You don't have roads, you don't have railroads. You're not going to Albany or New York or Boston from the Burlington area. You're going north to Montreal and Quebec City. So for the Allens, good relations with Canada are absolutely essential. And they think they'll get better relations if Vermont is independent. So the war ends. Settlement starts to pour into northern Vermont. The military threat of the British is over. This is the best cheap land in New England, is the Champlain Valley. And Ira moves north from Sunderland, where he had spent the war, and Chittenden moves back to Williston, and Ethan moves to the Intervale at Burlington. The Allens and their friends are in place now, and you can reinstitute the Grand Plan. Now, Ira has other interests in the late 1780s. He gets married. In 1789, he'd been a bachelor for 38 years or thereabouts. He marries my favorite Miss Enos. He's 37, 38, she's 24. Never any sense in my research on Ira that family took first place over business with him. His brother Levi, lovable ne'er-do-well, whose letters are at UVM, writes to Levi's wife Nancy, "The sun, the moon, the stars do not shine as bright when we are apart. I love you, I miss you, when will we be together again?" Ira signs his letters to Jerusha, "Your friend Ira Allen." Now, even Leslie would admit that I'm more romantic than that. Ira spends a fair amount of time doing something that has made him very unpopular in certain circles in 21st century Vermont. He helps lead the charge to evict the Swanton Abnaki. They come back after the war, they want their villages, they want their lands. Ira wants them too, because they're on the falls of the Missisquoi. He wants the mill site. The land has been cleared, it's prime real estate. The settler-speculator argument becomes Native Americans in northern New England gave up their legal rights because they backed the British in the Revolution. So they can't come back. Now, there are plenty of documented instances of Native Americans from the Vermont and Canada area fighting for the Americans. So this is not necessarily an argument based on fact, but it's effective in Vermont Caucasian courts. Ira helps create the University of Vermont. Vermont joins the Union, 1791, March. One of the first things you know the legislature is going to do that autumn in its October session is charter a university, because a new state needs a university. We need to be serious. Ira helps move that sentiment along, and in the summer of 91, there's a bidding war. The towns that want to be home to the university bid. So much in real estate, so much in building materials, so much in cash. Rutland, Bennington, Williamstown, Middlebury, Windsor, Woodstock, they all put in bids, and the top bid is £400. And Ira looks, which is a fair amount of money in 1791. Ira looks at the list and goes, and adds a zero. I'll do £4,000. Bidding war is over. And the university is in Burlington, Vermont today because of what Ira did. He donates, how many of you here are UVM people in one way or another? Okay, not as many as at most of these talks. You go to UVM, the Central Green, Waterman, Williams Science Hall, all of that is land that Ira donated. And he says, that's 1,500 pounds of my 4,000. And the new trustees say, great, now all we need is the 2,500 pounds in cash. And we can build some buildings, and we can hire people. And he says, it's coming, just be patient. And he keeps saying this for years. And the reason, because by the middle of the 1790s, the grand plan was send the goods of the frontier, timber, potash, beef, hogs, grain, the things you can grow and produce on a farm, in effect, north to Canada. Big lumber rafts laden with Vermont products. They'll wind up at Quebec City because you float them on Lake Champlain, which goes north, into the Richelieu River, which flows north, into the St. Lawrence, which flows to Quebec City, the largest city in North America. Great, we're gonna make a lot of money. And we will bring back from Quebec the manufactured goods that frontier people need and want, but can't yet make. We'll make money in both directions. That's the grand plan. Levi sets up at St. John as the Canadian agent, having been a Tory during the American Revolution. The grand plan falters on three major problems. One, Vermont has joined the Union, so all trade agreements are U.S. Great Britain, not Vermont and Great Britain. We cannot operate except under U.S. trade rules. You get your rafts to the north end of Lake Champlain, and sometimes the British customs officials say, great, come on in. Sometimes they say, oh, I've got some big fees for you today. And sometimes just for fun, they throw your stuff in the lake. So this makes it hard to operate consistently as a businessman. Number two, the Richelieu is a tricky waterway for moving stuff in large amounts. It has rapids. In high water, the rapids break up your rafts. In low water, the rafts can't get across the rocks. So that's a serious problem. And finally, when you get your rafts and your other stuff to Quebec City, the Quebec merchants know you cannot go back. You cannot float back in the other direction against the current. And Ira's letters are full in the 1790s of denunciations of Quebec merchants. They're giving me 2 cents on the dollar for my stuff, and I don't have any choice. I have to take it. So he's losing money. He can't pay his land taxes. In retrospect, he had 200,000 acres of northwestern Vermont. He should have sold half of it, raise some cash, be able to do your business, etc. And he doesn't do that. By 1795, he is drowning in red ink, in lawsuits, in back taxes, in lack of any cash flow. But he has a plan. And this is one of the things I really like and admire. I would have given up many times in Ira's life. But there's a plan to get him out of trouble. He goes to Boston in December of 1795. He mortgages, does not sell, some of his best lands to a Boston speculator investor. He puts the resulting cash in gold into the bottom of a trunk, a false bottom, and he sails to England. It's the first time he's left North America. He goes to London, and he asks for meetings with the leaders of the British government, the colonial secretary, etc. And he says, I have a plan. It's a great plan. We are going to build a canal around the pesky parts of the Richelieu. And we're going to make it big enough and deep enough that we can take an ocean-going vessel from Burlington to England. And we're going to make it the other way too. Ocean-going vessels can go from England to Burlington. Burlington will be a seaport. Canada will benefit. England will benefit. Vermont will benefit from this two-way trade. And, well, yes, Ira Allen will benefit, but I'm only doing this for other people. I'm not interested in myself. Chittenden had made Ira a major general in the militia, state militia, before he went, so he'd have a title, General Ira Allen of Vermont. This doesn't do him any good at all in London. He's just a colonial wannabe. He doesn't dress very well. His grandparents weren't Duke and Duchess anything. And he can't get in to the decision makers. He says, they kept me dancing attendance for months at a time. Finally, he gets in to see the undersecretary of somebody. And that guy says to him, well, yeah, that's a pretty good idea. We might do this someday. But what in the world do we need you for if we go ahead with this? And this just enrages him. He's Ira Allen. Don't they understand this? You and I, at that point, would have snuck back across the Atlantic, try to salvage something here at home. Not Ira. Ira has plan B. Another thing I love about Ira, there are always two ways of getting to exactly the same objective. If you cannot deal with England in 1796, to Ira, it's obvious. You cross the English Channel and you go to France, England's greatest enemy on the planet. And you go to Paris and you say to the Directory, which has lopped the heads off of most French aristocrats, king and queen and everybody else they knew, and you say to the Directory, you guys are talking a lot about liberté, égalité, fraternité, exporting democratic revolution, monarchies should go, etc., and you're going to lead the way. Have I got an idea for you? Look across the Atlantic. Your French-Canadian brethren, who are 90% of the population in Canada, have the boot of British tyranny on their necks. They want to be free. You give me muskets, cannon, some operating money. I will cross the Atlantic with those guns. I will recruit hardy Green Mountain Boys to the number of 10,000. You will send a small army of 3,000. We will overwhelm the weak British garrisons. Britain is not really defending Canada at this point. And we will declare the new Democratic Republic of United Columbia. And the French Canadians will be free. Revolution will be exported. Democracy will grow, and we'll really stick it to the British, who took away your principal North American property. And he says to them, gentlemen, you and I are worldly sophisticated men. We don't need rhetoric, we don't need symbols, but the little people do. They're going to need something to rally behind. So he gives them a flag. He says, this will get us people. People will rally to the flag. It's horizontal stripes, red, white, blue, and green. So presumably the French tricolor, the United States of America, and green presumably for Vermont. And the flag is still in the French archives. It's sitting there. He actually created one for them to be able to visualize this. And the Directory loves it. They say, wow, we really do want to export revolution. We really do hate the British. Canada, as our trading partner, could be very lucrative. And yeah, this little guy says, when we have the United Columbia, we should build a ship canal around the falls of the Richelieu. He might get rich from that because we'll be trading directly with Burlington as a seaport, but that's okay. The bigger picture is still good for France. They give him 20,000 muskets, which are free to the French because they've conquered various other armies. And there's no interchangeable parts. Not everybody's carrying an AK-47 in 1796. An Austrian gun doesn't work with a French gun or a German gun. So they have the free guns to give him. They give him some startup money on the Batavian Republic in Holland, which they've created, and they give him bonds. Doesn't cost the French anything. They give him paperwork saying he bought the guns. Didn't pay a nickel for the guns. It's fake paperwork. Ira collects this stuff, puts it on a ship at Ostend Harbor, which has a wonderful name for a gun runner. It's called the Olive Branch. And he takes his guns back across, heading for Canada, Vermont, fame, fortune, success. He gets 8 days out, heading across the North Atlantic, and the British take him up. They must have been a James Bond, shaken not stirred, in Paris in the 1790s, because the British know what's going on. They send a warship, HMS Audacious. They pick him up. He waves his paperwork at the captain. The captain laughs. They take him back to Portsmouth. They put his guns very close to high tide level so that they'll rust out in case he ever gets them back. He won't be able to use them. And then they put him in the British court system. And some of you probably read Bleak House, Dickens, in high school or college. Yeah, Jarndyce versus Jarndyce, the longest running court case in British legal history, is a centerpiece of that novel. I think Dickens must have heard about poor Ira Allen and what happened to him, because the Brits put him in court for 18 months. They team him up with a judge who hates Americans and starts every court session saying so, and thus hates Ira Allen. And they keep him going on, and your commas are in the wrong place. If you just had more paperwork. And after a year and a half, he has time to write a history of Vermont and publish it in London. The principal point of which is that a ship canal is a great idea on the Falls of the Richelieu. You know, a little map with that shown. Year and a half, the Brits say, you got to have better paperwork. Just a little more, and we'll give you back your guns. Well, Ira makes the worst decision of his life. He goes back across the English Channel to France, assuming that his friends in the Directory will help him again, not knowing that France's version of the Wheel of Fortune has spun several times. All of his friends are dead or exiled. The new leaders of the Directory take one look at him and say, short little guy, comes straight from England with England's approval, doesn't speak a word of French. He must be a British spy. They throw him in prison. They don't say why. Habeas corpus isn't a great French concept in the 1790s. And they just leave him there. He suffers terribly because in Paris in 1790s, you don't pay for your food, you don't eat in prison. Americans in Paris give him handouts, and his health declines. He writes plaintive letters back home to a family that can't help him across the Atlantic. This goes on for over a year, and then suddenly the French let him out. They don't tell him why, just like they didn't tell him why they arrested him. They just get out. We need the room. Takes him a year to get permission to leave France and to regain his medical health so that he can live through a voyage. Comes back, lands at Philadelphia in January of 1801, makes it back to Vermont in the spring of 1801. He's been gone for 5.5 years. He thought he'd be gone 8 months. And he comes back and everything is in ruins. Land speculators have nibbled away most of his property. They've been sold for back taxes. His own nieces sue him because they say, our fathers were in the Onion River Land Company. We want their share. And Ira says, yeah, except they died and I raised you. And I used up their share, seeing to it that you had clothes and food and housing. They don't buy it and their husbands don't buy it. He's beset on every side. He's threatened with imprisonment for debt. Because in those days, if your creditor can find a judge to say, yes, he owes you money, they can throw you in prison. And you don't have to let you out until you pay your debt, which you cannot do while you are in prison, of course. It's a bad circle. Ira gets a year's relief from the legislature. They say, yeah, all right, we'll give you a year to sort it out. You've been away. Year comes and goes. He doesn't sort anything out. He asks for another year. The legislature says, forget it. This is fruitless. Ira calls his creditors, most of whom are in Burlington, come to my house. He is living, if you know Winooski City, the Eagle Block is where his house was, going down to his mills and forges at the Falls of the Winooski. That's his center of his empire. Come to my house, all your claims will be satisfied. The creditors come, they eat and drink in the front parlor. Ira slips out the back door, gets on a horse, rides to the river, gets on a small boat, and goes to Lake Champlain in the dead of night. This time he goes south against the current. He goes all the way to Kentucky, because in Kentucky is Matthew Lyon, former Vermont congressman, former patron or patriarch of Fairhaven, an Allen ally since the Revolution. There's a loophole in the federal bankruptcy law, and it says if you can get one person of standing to say to a judge, nobody has a claim against you of $50, the judge can declare you federally immune to imprisonment for debt. Well, Matthew Lyon probably knew 500 people in Vermont who had claims of $50 against Ira. He perjures himself. He's a big deal in Kentucky. Nobody knows, nobody cares. And the judge says, fine, Mr. Allen, they can't arrest you. Well, Ira knows that's not going to work in Vermont, because back here, his creditors have clout, have pull. They're going to find a judge who will put Ira back in prison. So he goes to Philadelphia, and he spends the last 10 years of his life there. He has almost no money. His health is gone. He writes letters to Jerusha saying, bring the kids. I've got an old French priest who can be their tutor, and then we'll put them in this private school. I'm ready for you. No evidence at all she ever answers him. She certainly never leaves Winooski or Colchester. My theory is in 5 years of his being gone, she learned to live without him. And she said in 1802-3, there's no way I'm following your dreams down to Philadelphia. I've got friends, I've got family, I'm not going. His health declines, his mental capacities certainly decline. He continues to publish like crazy books and pamphlets all about the Olive Branch affair. France owes me money. England owes me money. The United States owes me money. Somebody is going to pay me off here. And it's increasingly disjointed, increasingly irrational. It's a mind in decline. And then in the last year of his life, Ira is reborn. He's staying at a seedy boarding house in Philly, and these Spanish-American mercenaries come. And how they wound up there, I have no idea. But their goal, their stated goal, is raise money in America, go south, and liberate northern Mexico, Texas, from Spanish control. And Ira is reborn. He says, guys, do I know revolution? I had a great revolution in Vermont, and look how well we wound up. Addition to the federal union, 14th state, I had a great revolution planned in Canada till those pesky Brits caught me. You guys, take your money, recruit your army, take northern Mexico by storm, and I'll give you two things. One, I'm going to be your American ambassador. When you create your new country, I will represent you in America. And two, my advice to you, and this is priceless to you, take a printer. You will win far more battles in the northern Mexico by persuading people to join you with your propaganda than you will with your guns. And he gets them a printer. And he signs up a New Englander. And the first printing in what is today Texas is this guy on the back of a wagon with the invading army. It's called the Gutierrez de Lara expedition. It fails miserably. It's 20 years before the Alamo and Jim Bowie and Davy Crockett and all that. I think it's a good thing that Ira never learns that the expedition fails. He dies in hope He still thinks it's going to happen before the news comes back to the north. He dies in January of 1814. He's 62. The physician says retrocedent gout. In my mind, he wore out. He had suffered so much in Paris, in prison, he just doesn't have any more to give. He's totally bankrupt. He's penniless. The Quakers have to come and take his body and put it in the Free Quaker Cemetery. I've looked for 40 years. Back here in Vermont, there is one mention of his death in the Burlington Weekly, the Burlington Sentinel. Died in Philadelphia, General Ira Allen, late of Colchester. And that is it for a guy who had once been the richest man and one of the most powerful men in Vermont. And I think the reason is, by 1814, Ira has slipped into the shadows of Vermont history. He's been gone for 20 years. And anybody who remembers it probably says, yeah, wasn't he one of Ethan's brothers? Sly, sneaky guy, don't remember him very well anymore. And Ira has stayed there the 2 centuries since. Again, you can't find a part of Vermont that isn't somehow named after Ethan Allen or Chittenden County or what used to be Chittenden Bank, etc. Once you get past the town of Irisburg and the town of Ira, there isn't much in Vermont that you can say, oh yeah, that's named after Ira Allen. It doesn't matter, this is my closing argument, whether you admire him. I would argue that Ira Allen, up to the age of about 40, is bold, brave, Vermont all the way, is at the very least highly respectable, and in many ways admirable. After that, financial desperation leads him down darker paths that make him less than an admirable person. But I'd also argue that those differences, those nuances, those subtleties make him human, that we're all imperfect creatures. And what Ira did accomplish for Vermont, you got to keep him in the picture. And we're past the white knights on shining white horses, etc., and pedestals. We can have founding fathers with some flaws. Ira is the Vermont epitome of the frontier entrepreneur in America. Every American frontier has men and women who don't look at the edge of their farm as their domain, who don't say, gosh, I can chop down some trees, I hope I can put in a crop, I hope I can survive the winter. Ira looks at the wilderness and says, Burlington, shining city on a hill with a university, Lake Champlain teeming with waterborne commerce, a mill at every falls, a village in every one of these wilderness towns. You've got to have these dreamers in American society. Most of them go bankrupt, from Maine to California. Most of the frontier entrepreneurs do not make the fortune. It's the next generation that realizes the dream. In Burlington, it's the Catlin brothers. It's Gideon King, Admiral of Lake Champlain. It's the people 20 years later who realize the dream that Ira envisioned. But keep him out of your picture of Vermont, and your picture is incomplete. So put him in, read the book, learn a whole heck of a lot. I'll give you 3 things that I think will happen. One, I think you'll have a good time, because he's involved in so much interesting stuff. He's not a stay-at-home and not do anything kind of person. He's in danger a lot of his life, so I think you'll enjoy it. 2, I am pretty sure you're going to learn an awful lot more about early Vermont, because other than religion, there's almost nothing about early Vermont he's not involved in. I cannot find any evidence that Ira Allen entered a church in his lifetime. He's a deist. God is around us. We don't need ministers. He and Ethan are on the same page with this. I think it's ironic that Ira Allen Chapel is named after a guy who never went to church. But there's a backstory, and you can ask about that in Q&A. And finally, I am absolutely certain that whether Ira Allen is watching you from down there or up there, he'll enjoy the attention. Thank you. All right, questions, rebuttal, short speeches disguised as questions so you can show your neighbors how much you know. I'm not pointing to Howard Coffin for any of this business. All right, I will give you guys further info. Why is Ira Allen Chapel named after a guy who never went to church? And the answer is because there was a wealthy retired Vermonter named James Benjamin Wilbur living in Manchester, Vermont in the 19-teens and 20s. Made his money out west, retired to Manchester. If you know Manchester at all, the Wilburton Inn was James Wilbur's house. Approximately the size of this building. And for some reason, Wilbur decided he wanted to collect Vermont history, and he adopted Ira as the overlooked hero of early Vermont. And he started to collect early Vermont history, anything he could get his hands on that related to Ira, photocopy or original. And in 1928, James Wilbur publishes an 800-page very ponderous 2-volume biography. Guy Bailey, most of you UVMers have heard of Guy Bailey, was president of UVM, a master fundraiser in a time when UVM really needed money. And he seizes on James Wilbur as the financial savior. Their correspondence is at UVM and Special Collections, so I've read a good deal of it. You are so smart, Mr. Wilbur. You are so wonderful. We almost need to erect a statue to you for how wonderful you are. How'd you like to be on the board of trustees? Oh, good. How'd you like to put up a statue of your hero, Ira? You've been on the green. Ira Allen, founder of this university, founder of Vermont. Neither is actually true, but Wilbur picked the text. Great. You know, a university should have a chapel. How'd you like to build us a chapel? And you can name it. Oh, sure, we'll name it after Ira Allen. So they build the chapel. We're building a museum. The Fleming family has paid for a building, Fleming Museum, but we want to make it bigger. How'd you like to add the back third of it? Oh, and you'd like to put Thomas Chittenden, Stephen Rowe Bradley, Ethan Allen, and Ira Allen on the walls? Great, we're going to do that for you. Oh, and we'll take your collection and put it, and the Wilbur Room was on what is today I guess really the front entrance has been moved away from Colchester Avenue. And it all works. James Wilbur becomes UVM's biggest supporter and donor. He's autocratic, he's patrician, he's demanding, and Guy Bailey just works him like nobody's business. When the biography comes out, boxed set, every trustee is required to purchase one and to read it enough to be able to say at the next trustees meeting, what a wonderful book that is, Mr. Wilbur. And George M. Powers was Chief Justice of the Vermont Supreme Court then. He's also a trustee. And his daughter told me this, 50 years ago. Mom and Dad were sitting in the study by the fire, and Dad is trying to make his way through this biography. Mom is reading the newspaper, and she looks up and says, oh my goodness, Mr. Wilbur died. And Dad picks up the biography, throws it in the fire, and says, I don't have to read that damn thing. If you want to learn about Ira Allen, Wilbur's biography is wonderful on the what. It's not so hot on the why or the so what. It's a hagiography. It's an adoring account of Ira, the perfect early Vermonter. I'm glad Wilbur did his work. I'm glad he collected the collection because it meant I could do most of my research in my own office at Special Collections. But that's why Ira Allen Chapel is named after a non-believer, a famous deist. All right, who wants to know about the wife and children? This is something He marries Jerusha. She's 15 years younger. They have 3 children. Ira Hayden Allen is born in 1792. Zimri Enos Allen. She had been Jerusha Enos, takes his mother's family name as his middle name, is born a few years later. And Julia, it varies. I'm going to call her Julia Mariette, because that's the last name we know for her. It's either Julia Marietta, Julie Mariette, we don't know for sure. She's born. Zimri Enos Allen dies about 1801 or thereabouts. He's a student at Middlebury, training to be a physician. He's 22 years old. Julia Marietta dies at the Girls' Academy in St. Albans. She's about 14. And UVM Fleming Museum has a beautiful silk memorial piece that one of her classmates stitched for her, sacred memory of. Ira Hayden Allen is the only child of Ira's who lives to full adulthood. And when Ira dies in 1814, there is nothing left of his empire. But in 1789, when he married Jerusha, his wedding present to her was the entire town of Irisburg in Orleans County. You up to, get to Newport, you've gone too far north. Well, I'm sure in 1789 she looked at this, yeah, great, 35,000 acres of wilderness, 100 miles from here. What about a Cuisinart? What about a Mercedes? Something I can actually use. But it's hers. It's not Ira's anymore. So she saves it. She pays the taxes. When he dies, she and her son move to Irisburg, and they lease out lands, and they count their pennies, and they lay out a township. And by the Civil War, Ira Hayden Allen is the richest man in Orleans County. He has no adventure in his life. He never takes a chance. He never does anything exciting. But he realizes the fortune that his father and his uncles had set out as their goal. He's not the nicest guy in Orleans County. In the 1850s, Henry Stevens of Barnet is the first president of the Vermont Historical Society. And he finds out that Ethan Allen's son is living in poverty in Michigan. He's an old man. And Stevens says, gosh, wouldn't it be great if we could buy him a farm here in Vermont and bring him home and let him die in peace here in the Green Mountains where he was raised? Quite reasonably, Stevens looks at Ira Hayden Allen, richest man in Orleans County, and says, that's your first cousin. You played with him when you were children in the Burlington area. And Ira writes him the coldest letter you can imagine. It's in the Stevens papers at UVM. Yeah, I knew him as kids. We were buddies. But so what? I don't owe him anything. I'm not giving you any money for this. Ira Hayden Allen could have bought the farm with the change from the cushions of his couch. And he stiffs the whole thing, and the project dies. Stevens gives up, and son never makes it back to Burlington. So that's the story of the Allens. Are a powerful force in 19th century Irisburg. They continue there into the 20th century. There are some descendants of Iras out there. Most people who say I'm descended from an Allen claim Ethan because he's the hero, and most of them are wrong. And we used to spend a fair amount of time at both VHS and at UVM disproving their claims. Which David Souter, Supreme Court Justice, once told me he was descended from Ira, and I pointed out that, no, you're not. He was very nice about it. So there are some Allens left. Unfortunately, none of them is ready to redeem the 2,500 pounds that Ira still owns. And I've always thought this is ironic. I mean, I did a fair amount of fundraising for UVM, and I've always known that the highest grade of donor at UVM is the Ira Allen Society. Now, if I go and pledge my $10 million tomorrow and I don't pay it, they're going to take back the paperweight and the socks and the UVM tie and things that they give you if you're a donor. So I've always found this kind of amusing that the Great Society is named after the guy who didn't fulfill the pledge. He wanted to. He really did believe in UVM and in education, but he just never had the money. Yes, ma'am.
When you go on, I guess it's 14 through Irisburg, aren't there some fairly noticeable homes kind of on the
Yep.
knoll there. Do any of those?
I don't think any of those were Allen homes, because I've always understood that Ira Hayden Allen's principal house burned in the late 19th century, and the report I read said it was full of papers. And this just breaks my heart. Vermont history has lost so much great history stuff to fire, from the State House here in Montpelier to other great leaders' homes being torched, and it breaks my heart.
Is it possible that the family bringing some money to that vicinity influenced perhaps other residents? And it always surprises me when I go through Irisburg. It's like there's at least one big square house.
Yeah, oh, there's a beautiful yellow house just as you enter. The money in Irisburg was in timber. In the late 19th century, lumber was that's what that big yellow house funded. The Allens are really out of any wealth by 1900. Ira Hayden Allen only has one son who survives, two daughters who marry, different surnames, of course, once they're married. Jerusha does donate the land for the town green. If you look at it's got a lovely little town green with a beautiful little library where I spoke a couple, 3 months ago, and town offices around it. It's a very nice little green. But you blink twice and you're through Irisburg. It's pretty small. But it makes Ira Hayden Allen capable of doing. He's a big investor in the Passumpsic River Railroad. He's got money to spend, and it's pretty well gone in 2 generations. Yes, sir.
When you were telling the story about Ira going to England, or to France, and offering to have 10,000 militiamen, how possible would such a thing have been if he were able to get that? Like, did he have any influence to do something like that?
He certainly couldn't have recruited 10,000 Vermonters. Maybe he could have put together 5,000 adventurers, promising them money, looting, whatever else. His argument to France was that the French-Canadian population would rise. A fair number of people promised that. The Fenians in the 1860s promised that the Canadian people would rise against England. Those didn't work out so well. So I think what Ira probably really was counting on was the 3,000 French soldiers. And the British military was weak in Canada. You might very well have been able to overwhelm them, but then the French would have had to defend it for you too. And so it was quixotic, I think. Ira's later argument for the British in court: I bought the guns to sell them to the state militias. I'm just a businessman. I'm going to take them back, and there are 15 states. They all have militias. I'm going to equip them so that guys don't have to go out with a broomstick on their shoulder at militia training day. Almost plausible. It might have had some possibility, but it wasn't what he was really doing. He never admitted what he was really doing, but the records in British and French and American archives are irrefutable. It was a really cool idea, but it didn't have anything to do with arming the militias of the states. Yes, sir. Well, I misused. Yes, you there, guy in the back. Howard and I are dear old friends. We are the geezers of Vermont history.
We got to know each other 40 years ago.
Yeah, at least.
We
Yeah.
were both working at UVM. He was at Special Collections and I was in the news office. And we got to be pretty good friends.
Absolutely.
And then I went on to work for Jim Jeffers.
Yeah.
He should have been a teacher of history at the University of Vermont, but he wasn't.
Yeah.
That's one of the biggest mistakes the university ever made. But he went on and saw the world. He was a gift to Kentucky and Michigan. And then one day, a few years ago, I was about to give a talk up in Morrisville, and in walked Leslie and Kevin. And my God,
It only took him 20 minutes to remember who I was.
we've been really close friends ever since.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to ask you a question here in a minute.
Well, I said short speeches, folks.
That's why I'm standing up here. But he's back. And we are so lucky because this is a great historian. And he's one of the great Vermont historians in the history of this amazing.
It's going to cost me a lot of lunches.
You just be quiet and listen to him. Because you deserve it. He's back here. He came back, and this is his gift to us, and God knows how many more books there's going to be. He came out with 2 in the last few months, shaming me. But
It's always been my goal.
anyway, Kevin, dear friend, I'm glad you guys are back here, and it's wonderful. My question is, we're coming up on the 250th
We are.
in this state. I don't see an awful lot is being done about it. But I'm wondering what you think we ought to be focusing on in the 250th commemoration, not only given the history and what was happening then, but what's happening in this country today.
Well, I'll limit myself to the in Vermont stuff. You guys don't need my disquisition on American politics, believe me. There's a lot left to be done on early Vermont. We have far too little on women on the frontier. We've concentrated on the men. We know a lot about the Allen brothers. We don't know nearly enough about the Allen women, and you can expand that into all of the Vermont population. Howard and I have talked about this. It's way past time for Hollywood to wake up and realize that Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold at Valcour Island, there are some great movies waiting to be made about early Vermont history and the war in the Champlain Valley. And I mean, I've already cast the movie. You need a young Russell Crowe to play Ethan. And it's just, there's so much potential if we just get those people to stop making comic book movies and vampire movies. We've got some great stories here. One of the things that has always bothered me, and perhaps the 250th is an opportunity, the Vermont Cultural Heritage organizations have never been very good at raising money, and their supporters have never been very good about making sure in your estate planning and otherwise that your favorite institutions have endowments, that they can ride out ups and downs in the economy or ups and downs in state government support. It just bugs the heck out of me. I don't particularly enjoy reading obituaries of my contemporaries, but reading them and knowing that Bill or Dave or Susie forgot to change their will to benefit VHS or the Arts Council or the Humanities Council. I mean, just pick the one you care most about and stop giving money to your alma mater and start giving it to places here in Vermont. If you're a Harvard graduate, your $1 million isn't worth a darn at Harvard. They're the richest school in the world. But to the Arts Council, $1 million is real money. To the Kellogg Hubbard Library, you can change the world with a check that won't do you much good and won't get your name on anything either, if that's what you're interested in at Middlebury or Dartmouth or anywhere else. So I hope that we can focus as a state on how much our heritage means, on the unexplored aspects of Vermont, that I don't like to say Vermont is unique. I don't like Vermont exceptionalism. But I know Vermont's distinctive, and I published a book 10 years ago called The Vermont Difference, in which 18 essayists pointed out things that Vermont does really well that the other states might take a look at. The environment, historic preservation, respect for reading and literacy. Now, we don't know anything about coal mining. We don't know anything about urban transport. But there are areas in which the Vermont example could be well taken up. And my current, for those of you again who are UVMers, my current craze, as Leslie will attest, is the Center for Research on Vermont at UVM. It's entering its 50th year, and probably had a dozen directors. Not one of them has ever made a bequest. Most of them have died, and they've never left anything to the center in their wills. The center should be a model for the other 49 flagship universities in this country. It is doing good work. It should be doing great work. And all we need is one lottery winner with a big heart who thinks that this is important. And Howard and I are trying on the lottery front, whether it's scratch-offs or Powerball tickets. We're doing our best here. Royalties aren't going to make it, although this is a good opportunity. Here we have Ira Allen biography, which Bear Pond will sell to you for $25. I have, I think, 12 copies that I do not want to take back home to Essex. I will sell you one for $20 tonight. So you get a chance to, and if you don't want me to sign it, I won't sign it. If you do want me to sign it, I will sign it. I'm told it's a pretty good biography. And the talk, if you liked the talk, I think you'd like the book. So, are we done? Questions? You've missed Wheel of Fortune, I'm sorry.
It really is a good book.
I think it turned out pretty well. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Why do you refer to founding fathers?
Well, it's the term. We've been using it for 2 centuries. The founding generation would be. It is. It absolutely is. Yeah, I'm old. Sometimes sometimes I don't get it just right. But you're absolutely right.
You did a great.
The founding generation would be much better. Yeah.
The other thing was when you were a kid running around the library, did you
Yep.
ever run into Senator Leahy being Batman?
No, I didn't know who Pat Leahy was or his family was. I grew up on Summer Street over in the meadow.
So a decade apart. So
Oh,
when
that's
you think
true.
about a kid that's
No,
10
no,
years
he
older
doesn't
than you,
know.
you don't really run into him in the library.
Yeah, I was here from 61 to 69. First grade, elementary school, middle school, and then 1 year at Montpelier High. And then we moved over to Williston, so I graduated from CVU. And this was a great town to grow up in. I mean, we moved up from New York when I was 6. Best thing that ever happened to me. I loved Montpelier as a place to live, and I have wonderfully fond memories of sports and the people that I went to school with, and it's a beautiful small city and smallest state capital in America. Only one without a McDonald's. We got all these wonderful things about Montpelier, and a wonderful library. When you get done funding the Center for Research on Vermont, you come see Carolyn, because this place could use a $10 million endowment gift. And for me, that's got to be a Powerball jackpot. So.
Just a fact, I just heard earlier today that 40% of the funding for Vermont Humanities Council comes from the federal government.
Oh, dear.
That's what my source today said.
That's true. 40% comes for Vermont Humanities, 40% comes from the federal government, 30% comes from state government, and they raise about $1 million a year to keep the lights on.
Yeah, that would be the norm for
So we're going to have to raise about $2 million.
well, and the Arts Council, I assume, may be in somewhat of the similar position, that they probably get federal funding as well.
So I gave a talk yesterday. Was that yesterday? Jeez, crow. It was yesterday. With Christopher Kaufman-Ilstrup out in the Adamant Community Center, and that was one of the things that he was talking about. He was saying he was actually grateful that they're a nonprofit, because he said their sister organizations around the country have 90% federal funding.
Oh my
and
goodness.
40%.
Yeah.
So they're worried, but they're in a better financial position now
Wow.
than other organizations in other parts of the United States.
I look around this state and I can't think of a museum, library, or heritage organization that has all the money it needs. Most of them, and I was a CEO at VHS, I was an administrator at UVM, et cetera. Most of them go into the year probably thinking they've got enough to survive the year, but not enough to do the great things they want to do, not enough to seize on new opportunity that might arise. And again, $1 million changes the world for any public library in this state. It really lets them do things that, it's a drop in the bucket, even at UVM, which is not overfunded. So I say give locally, and think globally, give locally, and go out there and buy those lottery tickets, please. For most of us, that's the only hope we've got for wealth, My mom used to say, just as easy to fall in love with a rich girl, Kevin. I married poorly, but perfectly, and I'm well aware of that. Both Leslie and I married poor. We had $14 in the bank when we married. And, that wasn't a lot even in 1978. So, all right, thank you, folks. Appreciate you coming out. Come buy a book.